Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar series, Our Warming Planet, Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation. Let's give everyone a couple of minutes to roll in, and then we can get started. So please give us a couple of minutes and we'll get started. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar series, Our Warming Planet, Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation. Thank you for joining us today. I would next like to introduce Dr. David Rind, NASA Emeritus, based at the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. David is a series editor of Our Warming Planet, and the series that we are discussing today is Volume 2. And I'm going to pass on to David to get us started today. Thank you, David. Over to you.
Thank you, Minishka. Yes, so you see on the slide the textbook, Our Warming Planet, and this is Volume 2, Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation. The first volume was with respect to the science of climate change. This one is Climate Change Impacts. And next October, there will be a third book having to do with radiation and clouds. This is the agenda for the meeting today. This introduction is moi. Minishka will give you some polls so that we can get to know the audience better. Then after some further introductions concerned with the editors of this book, Cynthia Rosenzweig is our speaker today, and her talk is Cities and Climate Change. Following that, there'll be a live question and answer session, and then there'll be a wrap up in which we try to make sense of what went on. Next slide. So again, those were the books, and this is for book number 2. These are the topics and authors. And as you can see, it's broken down into sections. Given that it's on climate change impacts, first we discuss in the book what climate changes we're talking about. Then the methods and approaches in dealing with understanding and adapting to impacts. Then impacts on various sectors, biodiversity, future of water, and in this case, Cynthia's talk on cities. Then we go geographically, effects on different regions and countries. We've had some of those talks already. And finally, having to do with the policy and practice of putting into a utilitarian implementation what we have learned about the ability to adapt to climate change, whatever climate change may occur. Okay, I think this leads us back to you, Minishka.
Thank you, David. This is an opportunity for us to get to know all of you. Since this is virtual, we'd like to get to know all of you more as a group and then also as individuals. So let's get started with the poll. We'd like to know which region you're participating from. I remember during our first webinar, the launch, we actually had participants from all regions. But I know that the time zone, unfortunately, doesn't work well for all regions, but we typically have a pretty good representation from across the world. So let's give it a few more seconds. We have 85% of the audience that have participated, so we can end the poll and show you the results. So there we have it. We have most of the geographical regions represented. Okay, and then let's move on to the next question, where we'd like to know which sector you work in. We've had times where there's been really great representation from all sectors, which has been really fantastic. And it looks like we have pretty good representation from most sectors today as well. We also have almost 80%, okay, 80% of you that have participated in this, which is fantastic. So I'm going to stop sharing this poll. I'm going to end it and then share the results. So as you can see, we have a pretty good representation from most sectors. And then on to the final question, where we'd like to know your involvement in climate change work. Great. Once again, we've got a range of people interested in climate change. And let's give it a few more seconds. We've got most of our audience that has participated. We'll just give it a few more seconds for a few more to participate, and then I'll share the results. Okay, I'm gonna end the poll now. And once again, really great to see everyone. Some people's work is directly linked to climate change. Some wish to educate people, so they are in the right place for sure for that. Thank you everyone so much. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. We'd like to get to know all of you as much as you like. Feel free to share your information. So please introduce yourself in the chat function. You can include as much or as little information as you wish. And you can include your name, country, institution, role, email, how you think this book might help you. And I'm just going to put that in the chat so you can start introducing yourselves. And okay, great. Thank you so much. And then over to David to introduce the editors.
Yes, so for this volume 2, one of the unique aspects of this Our Warming Planet textbook series is that each book is organized around sort of a lead person who has sort of tentacles out to all the different people who have been invited to give talks, basically. And for volume 2, it's Martin Perry, who, as you can see, is visiting professor at the Center for Environmental Policy at the Imperial College London. He was co-chair of IPCC Working Group 2, which again is Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability, and a convening lead author in 3 IPCC assessments. He's been a professor of geography at the University of Oxford, University College of London, East Anglia, and Birmingham. And the sort of stellar component of the team for this book is the direct result of people's having such great respect for Martin that they were happy to participate in something which in effect honors the work he has done as a pioneer in looking at impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, in particular associated with climate change. Manishka Demel is a senior staff associate at Columbia's Earth Institute, which is at NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies. She leads the portfolio of conservation and development. She was the lead author on the UN Environmental Programme's 2020 Adaptation Gap Report and recipient of UNESCO's MAB Young Scientist Award, holds an MA from Columbia and an MSc from the University of Oxford. And finally, Cynthia Rosenzweig, who not only is an editor, but is also the speaker. So I will sort of combine the discussion of Cynthia here. And normally for somebody I know so well, I would just wing it. But Cynthia has done so much that in order to make sure I covered enough of what she's done, I've actually written it out. So Cynthia, I will read it about you. You don't have to blush.
Thank you, David. I'm blushing.
So not only is Cynthia a co-editor of this particular book, volume 2, she's a co-editor of the entire textbook series and one of the originators of the idea of it, the series Our Warming Planet. In addition, Cynthia, frankly, is the initiator of these webinars. None of these webinars would take place without Cynthia's idea for having them and involvement in making sure they got done through NOAA and through Columbia. On a more formal basis, Cynthia is senior research scientist and head of the Climate Impacts Group at NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies. And as you probably know, one aspect of Cynthia's work on impacts involves a focus on improving models and assessments on how climate change will affect agriculture and food supply in the future. In that regard, she's co-founder of the Agricultural Model Intercomparison and Improvement Project, nicknamed AGMIP, an international project using climate science, crop modeling, and economic modeling to understand crop yield and food security in a changing climate. It involves over 1,000 researchers from developed and developing nations, regionally and globally. And Manishka, we could go to the next slide. For that work, as well as other efforts, as you can see there, she was awarded this year's World Food Prize, a prestigious international award conceived as the Nobel Prize for Food and Agriculture. The goal is, as its mission, is to elevate innovations and inspire action to sustainably increase the quality, quantity, and availability of food for all. And in fact, Cynthia was giving talks on the potential influence of global warming on food supply at agricultural meetings at a time when nobody else from the agricultural community wanted to hear anything about it. Cynthia has also served previously as a coordinating lead author for the IPCC Working Group 2 Fourth Assessment Report in 2007, and the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change and Land in 2019. However, as you probably know by now, her talk today is not about any of that. Donning another of her many hats, she's the co-founder of the Urban Climate Change Research Network, UCCRN, and co-editor of the assessment reports on climate change in cities. This leads to what she will talk about today. Her chapter in the book is Climate Change Impacts, Climate Change Impacts and Adaptations. Her talk is entitled Cities and Climate Change. And the title of the book is very appropriate, for she was also studying in a very practical way possible adaptations to climate change when frankly, many only wanted to focus on mitigation. Finally, on a personal note, I've known Cynthia for some 40 years, and I've marveled at her ability to combine scientific zeal with organizational ability and personal relationships to get things done. I'm honored to consider her a close friend. Thanks, Cynthia, for giving this talk. Over to you.
David, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and right back at you. David and I have been close colleagues for 40 years, discussing all the aspects, and he has been my climate science guru all these years. Hi, everybody. I'm now going to share my screen and get started on cities and climate. Let's get this going. Uh-oh, wait a minute. That's not looking very good. Hey, wait a minute. Uh-oh.
That's fine. We have a backup in case you need it.
No, I want to get the one. I want to get my real one. Just a second. Sorry. Okay, now, if I hit share, will it go to share now?
It should, yes, you can try that.
Let's try this. No, that's not it. Okay, hold on. Sorry, just bear with me. It worked. It worked in the practice.
Yes.
There
should be a share screen button at the bottom. You can click that. It's should be highlighted in green. And that should allow you to share your screen.
Yes,
But you,
okay, here we go. Let's try again. Yes, I think it's here now.
yes,
Great.
we are seeing something now, and I think it'll, perfect. We see it, Cynthia, and
Okay, wonderful. Sorry for the glitch.
great.
Yeah, so I'm not going to be talking about food today. In the book, In Our Warming Planet, William Travis, who I know is on in the audience today, and also John Porter, ably carried the climate change and food flag for the 2 chapters in the Martin Perry volume. But so I picked up on another one of my research areas, which is cities and climate change. Just by way of quick introduction, how did we get started on climate change in cities? And it's because our institute, where David and Manishka and Jen and others are, Goddard Institute for Space Studies, is right smack dab in the middle of Manhattan and located on the Columbia University campus. So we would be going all around the world, you know, spewing greenhouse gas emissions for the IPCC, et cetera, and then coming back to our own home institute, which was right in the middle of a city. So that's when we really started to say, hey, wait a minute, climate change begins at home. And our home was in one of the major urban areas of the world. So to launch in on, to share some of the issues, the overarching themes, and where we are now on climate change in cities. So I'm going to start with 4 overarching themes that really set the stage for where cities and climate change are now. This slide, you're probably all, these data you're probably all familiar with. This is the role of urbanization. So we know that as of 2020, global urban population represented over 50% of the total world population, and it's the percentage of its presence in total global population is projected to grow to be almost 70% by 2050. And what you can see here with the blue is the world, green squares are the more developed regions, the population projections from the UN Population Fund. And then, of course, but it's in the less developed regions that this enormous urbanization trend is taking place now and is projected to increase. So urbanization is the first overarching theme. The second is sustainability, the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, as I was thinking about this, you know, we only have the goal is that's the 2030 agenda. We only have 8 more years the world has 8 more years to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Some of them are on track, some of them are not. There has been progress. But just want to highlight, for the very first time in the SDGs, for the first time, cities got their own goal. Number 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities. And the tagline is to make cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And sometime when we're all together, when we can see each other, and we hope the coronavirus is completely over, we can share the tales of what it was like to work. All the urban groups, including UCCRN and UCERN, got together and made a concerted campaign to get this SDG 11 into the SDGs. And it was not easy, especially the rural groups, the food security groups, the rural development groups felt very threatened. And we held many meetings, bringing them in and saying that urban and rural areas are connected, obviously, but to really assure them that we weren't taking over any of their turf in sustainable development goals. And it was just so great when I say I would carry my sleeping bag down to the UN. I was down at the UN so much during that campaign, but it's a really important recognition of the role of cities in sustainable development. The third overarching theme is equity and environmental justice. This has come more and more to the fore, and this absolutely has to be front and center whenever we think about climate change in cities. And because cities, it's so clear that in cities, the vulnerability to climate change varies across social groups, economic levels, neighborhoods. You can see the neighborhoods here. This is the social vulnerability index that was done for the New York City panel on climate change. And one reason why it's so important for researchers to do work on vulnerability and this kind of spatial analysis, and I'm going to give another example at the end of the talk, because it can aid in the targeting of adaptation resources. No city has enough funds to protect every single neighborhood equally. And that's just the reality of the financial requirements. And so this is a really important area for researchers and policymakers and city governments, and of course NGOs as well, to work together to identify what are the priority areas, where are the most vulnerable groups who need the resources for resilience and adaptation the most. The final overarching theme is infrastructure and critical dependencies. And when we think about what is a city is two things: the people and the infrastructure. And combining these two, cities are sometimes referred to as complex socio-ecological systems. And when UCERN and Assessment Report on Climate Change and Cities study climate change, it's this interaction, these complexities between the neighborhoods, the people, the vulnerabilities there, as well as a city has to maintain its critical infrastructure, and it's not really, and the complexity then extends to these are all very co-located and affect each other. So for example, if the electricity goes out, then the water, the elevators in the building won't go up, people can't get to their homes, the water pumps in the buildings don't work, people can't charge their cell phones, the communication breaks down. There is this concatenating cascade of the interdependent systems. And this is very much why it's the fourth overarching theme. So now let's enter climate change. So one of the things that UCERN did for I think the very first time was, previous to this map, making these kinds of maps, all these maps of climate change and would have country borders on it, country boundaries. And we realized from working with New York City and other cities that the cities had a tremendous role to play, and that we better make a map that showed where are the cities going to be affected and what temperature changes are they going to be experiencing and projected to experience in the future. So this is showing from ARC 3.2, mean change in annual temperature, 2070, that's at the end of the century, 2070 to 2099, relative to 1971 and 2000. This is the mean of 35 global climate models and 2 representative concentration pathways, 4.5 and 8.5. So these are on the extreme end. But look at those cities, all basking in the heat. not basking, all suffering from the heat, as we've just seen just very recently in New Delhi. Now, at the same time, so that's the climate change heat part, but cities have long dealt with other environmental stresses as well. So of course, the urban heat island, probably more papers have been written, more research papers have been written on the urban heat island than any other environmental issue and stress in cities. And here's our very own New York City heat island. But there is also the potential, there's not just the potential, there's the actual extreme rainfall events over short periods of time, combined with the impervious surfaces of city, cause urban flooding. And one of the climate change projections and also observations that's already happening is greater heavy downpours, these cloudbursts that cause tremendous disruption of urban transportation systems, for example, and also flooding in basements in low-income neighborhoods. And then, of course, air quality. We can't forget air quality. Cities are places that suffer from poor air quality, and then so all of these things, as the cities develop their resilience plans for climate change, these other stresses need to be taken into account as well. So these are just some examples of the extreme events in cities. Chicago heat wave, which had tremendous mortality, again, in low-income neighborhoods. The flooding in Bangkok, 2011, of course, sea level rise, and Hurricane Katrina, and then the sea level rise is also the very, very key projection of climate change, already happening, already causing exacerbated nuisance flooding. And when a hurricane comes along, like Sandy, because the sea level rise is already higher, that flooding did go in further due to sea level rise. And then, of course, look at the devastation from coastal typhoons and storms around the world. So cities are on, the conclusion here is cities are on the front lines of climate change and have a tremendous role to play in responding to them. So let's now turn to how they can and will and are responding to these challenges and underlying forces and processes. So my real colleague in city crime, Bill Selecki, and David Simon have worked a lot on about transformation. And so this concept of transformation is kind of percolating around. It's been around for a few years now, and it's worth it to think about it, because how do we actually transform our cities to respond to these major challenges? So what's transformation? What is it? It involves large, abrupt, and persistent changes in structure and function of both physical or social systems. I would say I think it has to be both. Cities may not be able to address the challenges and fulfill their climate change leadership potential without transformation. Otherwise, things can be very incremental, here and there. Oh, we're doing a development project here by the coast. There's a lot of European development that way, I believe. But this idea of greater scale of change and response. And what it really takes is the final bullet here, which is urban transformation integrates both mitigation and adaptation, and we're going to come to that in a moment, in virtually every decision, plan, and implementation. And the beautiful graphic is by Jeffrey Raven in Vietnam on green and blue fingers in a city in Vietnam. Okay, so let's delve a little bit more deeply into transformation. So this is Bill's work, Bill Selecki's work on adaptation transition pathways. So they can move to a lower state, like collapse or resistance, and a narrowing of possibilities, or that's from left to right, but it can also go from, I'm getting my directions mixed up. Lower state to higher state is left to right, higher state to lower state, because things can be transformed in the wrong direction. We really have to be careful of that. So we want to move from collapse, resistance, resilience to transformation, with a widening of possibilities. And a final point here, very, very, very important, is the leapfrogging effect when you see those overarching arrows at the top. So that we could go from collapse to resilience, we could go from resistance to transformation. And some of the things, I think an example of this may be what's happening now in Europe, in regard to the energy systems and the dependence on fossil fuels from Russia. And the conflict is actually jumpstarting and potentially leapfrogging into a transformed state of European energy systems. So that's an example of how this transformation can be catalyzed and can work. So in ARC 3.2, these are the 5 takeaways. The book was 800 pages. And this is the main points of the book, the main recommendations of the book, all on just one slide, but I'm going to go through them a little bit more. We call this the yellow brick road to urban transformation, and the green color is sort of like the Wizard of Oz. So a key point here, equity and environmental justice always has to be kept in mind. I'm going to go through all of these, so I won't read them out here. But a key point of this is that you can't just do one. Basically, a city has to do all to achieve urban transformation. So the first one is bringing together. A lot of these are bringing things together, you'll notice. Bringing in mitigation and adaptation, which has been so siloed, as David was mentioning in his introduction. So that actions that reduce greenhouse gas emissions while increasing resilience are a win-win. Some estimates say that up to about 70% of greenhouse gas emissions are actually located in the city nexus, or city nexus around the world. So how can this be done? Urban planning, integrating mitigation and adaptation. So this on the left is a development. As I was mentioning, the Europeans are good at making these kinds of developments. You can see it's by the Baltic Sea, so they had to take resilience to climate change, to sea level rise into account, but at the same time, then they did a whole distributed district heating and cooling. On the right is building green roofs, reduces greenhouse gas emissions, helps inhabitants keep cool during heat waves, and collect stormwater. So it's this kind of multifaceted, multi-purpose transformation, which takes into account mitigation and adaptation, is important for cities. Now, here's another thing, bringing processes together: disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. We looked at those extreme events, and there is now really there's now very much there is progress on this with early warning systems for adaptation. We just worked with the WMO on a science brief for the World Adaptation Science Program on this, of preparing for both scales at the same time, both current extreme events and the long-term changes. Otherwise, everyone is just constantly being reactive to the next extreme event coming along. Bringing together the long-term view and the short-term view is essential. And this, by the way, is Staten Island, the effects of Hurricane Sandy. The next one is to co-generate risk information. Now, there's been lots and lots about this, and many of you maybe have done and are doing co-generation projects. So it's absolutely clear that risk assessments and climate action plans co-generated with both the stakeholders and the scientists are most effective. They enhance. Why? Why is that? It's because they enhance the relevance, the flexibility, and the legitimacy of the programs and policies. I mentioned here the urban design climate workshops, which focus on these, and I think I have one more slide on this later. Improving urban climate resiliency, reducing energy consumption, enhancing quality of life. And so UCERN has conducted the urban design climate workshops in cities all around the world. And if anyone would like to work with the we call them the UDCW team to set up it's really a series of workshops, and it's a relationship building exercise. It's not a helicopter in thing. Please be in touch and with me, and we'll hook you up, and we could start planning one. They're wonderful, wonderful engagements to help to work with urban planners and designers in cities around the world. The next one is recalling this, which is, again, remember, front and center always, the needs of the most disadvantaged and vulnerable citizens must be addressed in climate change planning and action in every city of the world. And as I said, I'm going to give an example of this at the end of the talk. The fifth and final pathway to transformation. It's a bit of a grab bag. It is, we brought three things together. It's like, what else do we need in our tool? What else do cities need in the toolbox? First of all, they need finance, and advancing finance and figuring that out is absolutely critical for cities to fulfill their role. And so for every time when we have our ARC 3, we have a finance chapter, economics and finance chapter. So those experts are busily working away. Another thing that's very, very clear is that governance has to be really working that across scales as well. So it's neighborhood, borough, what we have in New York City, city, state, nationwide policies for urban areas, as well as then leading to the global networks that are really these fantastic social, really, they really are helping cities to do peer-to-peer learning. So C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, Global Covenant for Mayors, ICLE, long-standing, great organization, and UCERN on the research side. So those are the three last things. So if a city can do all these things, they will be well on the way to transformation. So the next thing we did was, well, we need to then go beyond planning and go to implementation. So with the UCERN hub directors, who are in cities around the world, in the regions around the world, you can see these are six of the UCERN hubs that help to bring all this and gather the latest information from the cities and the regions of the world. Is to take the 5, you can see the 5 in colors, the 5 transformation pathways, and then assign levels of response. Assessment, assessment's the first step. Planning is maybe the second step. Initial implementation, then you get going, real implementation, and then very critically, evaluation as well. So we worked with the hub directors for each one of these cities. It's in a Nature Climate Change paper. And the cities rated themselves, because it's just a useful exercise, so a city can see, well, what are we doing well on in regard to transformation for climate change? What do we need to work on more? And you can see some of them have coordinating disaster risk reduction, Some of them have integrating mitigation and adaptation that they can bear down and work on more. So this, by the way, is the urban design climate workshops, because this is a way. So how do you get started and to actually work towards implementation? And the urban design climate workshops are really a way to really start bearing down, saying, how do we address efficiency? It's like the nuts and bolts. Efficiency of urban systems, form and layout, construction materials, vegetative cover, of course, that's the socio-ecological system part. And thanks so much to Jeffrey Raven, Christian Vanian, and the whole team for the really great work on the UDCWs. Okay, now at the end, there's a new ARC3 coming out. It's in process now, and I want to do a big, Bill Selecki is the lead editor, and I want to do a big shout out to Maria Dombrov, who is coordinating the whole thing. And I want to give a big shout out to the authors. Authors are working in cities all around the world on the author teams on these topics. And you can see, again, it's so the cities are so complex, the systems we need to look at. And some new ones are not just, we still always have to look at the infrastructure. We always have to look at the equity. But new topics are nature-based solutions, and Manishka Devel, our co-editor, is a coordinating lead author for nature-based solutions. Always urban climate science. New ones, data and role of technology, perception, communication, behavior. These are, it's always more and new and important that we as researchers and scholars work to bring the very best evidence base and foundational knowledge so cities can fulfill their role. I'm going to highlight this. The two that are going to be coming first in this series are COVID-19, cities and climate change, of course, because that's where we are. And I just read about 2 new variants today in the news. And I mentioned governance, enabling policy environments, and of course, just transitions. So just to give a very brief sneak peek at the wonderful author team of COVID-19 of this chapter. And highlighting what some of the things that they're bringing forward. Coping with climate change during and after the COVID-19 crisis requires the identification of the role of equity, co-benefits and trade-offs involved in the response actions intended to locally address both climate change and public health. For example, if there are vaccination centers, but if a coastal flood comes along and the vaccination center is in the coastal flood zone, that's not a good idea. This is an example of a trade-off. Again, holding the 2 timeframes at the same time, so challenging, but both short-term responding to the pandemic, the cities all had to step up and respond. At the same time, though, keep up their climate change preparations. And then, of course, sustainability, creating sustainable urban areas in the midst of these enormous challenges that the cities have gone through. So just this is in review. So we can't be posting this on the web, but all during the coronavirus pandemic in New York, we formed with colleagues, Janelle Knox-Hayes, Juan Camilo Osorio, and others. It was called CSC 19, Climate Stresses and CSC 19. And we conducted research in New York City, which is, was one of the original hotspots in the United States. And we found that the compound risks, we looked at them at the same time, of COVID-19 and heat stress are both public health and equity challenges. heat and COVID-19 exposure are both influenced by natural, that's like where the parks are, where the trees are, and the built environmental factors having to do with rental density, as well as high-rise buildings and the differentiation between the different kinds of density. And that the socio-demographic characteristics are significant indicators of both heat and COVID-19 exposure. So we really need to, we need to do more, I think, of this kind of work, looking at the multiple stresses, at the compound risks, remember, at the complexities, at the interdependencies. And then it was co-generated with the stakeholders in New York City who were doing the interventions, of which there were two main kinds. One is open streets, so that people could go out and not be in confined spaces for the COVID risk, and then cool streets, so that they would be able to be in shady places and again not in very hot apartments. So what we were able to do here is look at the green circles are places where the vulnerability and the interventions lined up. But the orange circles are where that coupling is lacking. And so this is a way that we then shared this with the New York City stakeholders, policymakers and planning in the city government, making these interventions so that then they can, as they further develop the programs, as they're doing right now for this summer, they can see where the high HVI stands for heat vulnerability index. Those are the hot areas, the hottest areas in the city, and then you can see the cases per census tract population in the gray. So that's an example of I think the kind of research that needs to be done so that we can really help address the transformations needed in the tremendously complex situation that cities find themselves in now. So to conclude, Bill Selecki's a very, very main point that he's just coming out of IPCC Working Group 2 and the synthesis report. Need for climate urgency is upon us. The decade of climate action, absolutely critical. Cities, more than ever, the city's role are important. They are sites for vital innovations and inclusive actions. And because of now the triple threat of climate change, coronavirus, and conflict that is affecting supply chains and in cities all around the world, the city's role in managing and transforming in response to these challenges is more important than ever. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. That was a fantastic talk. I would next like to introduce Jen Evans, who will lead the Q&A. We also have 5 of the Our Warming Planet authors as attendees, so welcome to them as well. And a few of them will be joining the Q&A, and then once we start off with some questions for Cynthia, we can have them take part in the Q&A session and discussion as well. Thank you. Jen Evans is a graduate research assistant. She recently graduated from Columbia's Masters in Climate and Society. So congratulations, Jen. And over to you for the Q&A.
Great, thank you, Anishka, and thank you so much, Cynthia, for your talk. So before I jump into the Q&A box, I just wanted to start by asking if you could expand on how you began your research into urban areas and climate change, and maybe some of the challenges you have faced in this research area.
Sure. Actually, we started it. There was a U.S. national assessment way before the current NCA ones. It was started at the end of the Clinton Gore administration, and the country was divided into regions. And one of the regions was from Boston, I think, to Washington, D.C. Joel Smith will probably remember. And so they asked, the national assessment folks asked me, and then I said, I need to bring Bill in. He's a social scientist, and I'm a physical and biophysical scientist. I said, we'll work on this together. And we talked about it. We said, you know what? We're not ready to do Boston to Washington. Nobody had ever done one city ever on climate change. And so we went back to them, and they said, we have to do the New York metropolitan region, because I do feel I'm a little bit of a New York chauvinist. And I said, if we could do New York, we're going to be able to, get going on cities. And that's how we started. And that was really the beginning of it.
Thank you. Okay, so it looks like from Leonard Nurse, we have, how might approaches to adaptation in cities in less developed countries be different from those in developed countries?
Yes. So Leonard, thanks for this question. And thank you so much for your wonderful talk from 2 weeks ago. So this leapfrogging, I want to bring up the potential for leapfrogging here, because right now in New York City, 95% of the infrastructure and buildings that are going to be there 50 to 100 years from now are already in New York City. But in developing cities, there's still the potential for leapfrogging, and then the development, making sure that the development is resilient now, and it takes climate change into account. So also UCERN is, and all the way that the city networks operate is completely horizontal. The good ideas, look at Curitiba in Brazil, with the buses, the bus routes that they made, that then was taken up all over the world. So people didn't have to climb up on the buses. They just came every 5 minutes and people walked on. So really and truly, I think it's absolutely a level playing field, and organizing, financing for developing cities is critical so that these innovations can take place there.
Great. And now I would invite David, if you have any questions where we can involve the other authors who are now on the panel as well.
Well, so this is a question for Cynthia, but I think it's a broad enough one so others can weigh in as well. When we talk about, for example, mitigation associated with cities, one has to recognize that the energy consumption used for cities is not necessarily located in cities. So for example, let's say cities want to buy eco-conserving buses. Well, what company is making that buses? What energy do they use to make those buses? Where's the raw materials coming from that make up those buses, or the batteries of those buses? Is it possible for cities to have some sort of stringent requirements in terms of what products they're bringing in that help in terms of mitigation in non-city environments? In other words, we're talking about cities as if they're islands of self-sustainability, but we know that's not true, that
Right.
They depend on other areas.
Right. This is a really great question. And I hope I can get to Nancy Kiang's question too, about the retrofits. This is the whole leakage boundary issue. Yeah, I mean, when we say 70%, coming from cities, that is not just within, like, for example, the 5 boroughs of Manhattan. It's not like that. And so just to give an example, so it's all mushed up, and this is a growth industry to try to really nail down where the greenhouse gas emissions are actually coming from. We're doing that in the food system as well. But one of the things that the C40 group is a large city group, which is really started by Mayor Bloomberg and the Bloomberg Foundation, is that the cities band together for procurement networks. And so that then David say, okay, they identify, here are the buses that you use. And then it gets to be, you see, a critical mass, so that the companies that are making it, who knows, that might be in Iowa or it might be in Thailand, right? Those industries can be grown. Can I quickly answer? I want to hear from the others, and then I want to hear from the other panelists. But just want to say to Nancy about the retrofits. So this is in New York City. This is absolutely like the biggest challenge. And some people, there's a variety of opinion on it. Some people say, oh, forget it, there's nothing we can do, you know, there's nothing. Others are designing it, because we've worked with them through UCERN. They are designing the most fantastic retrofits with all new, you know. By the way, we tried to get geothermal, and not geothermal, but oh no, it was the heat pump. We tried to get heat pump at GISS. we just haven't done it yet, because we want GISS to be, we want our building, we work on climate change morning, noon, and night. We want our building to be both, you know, greenhouse gas, low carbon, right, and resilient. But anyway, Nancy, there is the whole passive house movement. They're based in Germany, but now they're all over the world. There's tremendous opportunities, but it is a question of financing, because it's usually more expensive to do the retrofit. But for a city like New York, it's got to be. And by the way, there's now policies. New York has passed policies for its older buildings as well. So it's, yeah, it's a very good and important question. Okay, David, back to you.
Panelists, Joel, do you have anything you want to add?
Well, thanks, David, and Cynthia. That was a great talk. It's a nice overview of the urban issues. Yeah, I'm particularly interested in the question of transformation, and we could go on about that, and in terms of what it means, and in fact, there's some good commentary in the chat on this too, and how, you know, how it comes. I mean, transformations have happened clearly, you know, so many times in the past at, you know, at the urban scale and other scales. And my sense is they're probably an accident of whatever economic forces, demographic forces, other things, you know, they're not guided or planned. I mean, the difference now, I think, is that we're talking about transformations that we hope are planned. And as you say, with some desirable outcomes, you know, equity being one of them, as opposed to just letting things happen. And in fact, I'll make it just a comment parenthetically. We are seeing transformations, oftentimes they're inequitable. There was just a nice report on the PBS NewsHour the other night about building climate resistant homes in climate resilient homes, I should say, in East Boston, which have driven up prices and driven out the poorer people. So, you know, you get that, what I call it, green gentrification, I think they called it. So, you know, there's that. But I'm curious if you can elaborate on it, and also on the barriers to transformation. I mean, I think if you're talking about changes in location, livelihood, other systems, I mean, people resist that. You know, we always get this build back strong, build back better, right? Which tends to mean keep things the way they are. It's easier for politicians to talk about, oh, you know, you don't have to change. It's a lot harder to say, well, you just can't keep doing that, or you can't keep doing that in that location. So can you comment on some of the barriers to transformation? One other comment I like to make, and I'll throw it in a chat, there's a very, I've done less research on this than you, but I came across a very interesting example of visioning for transformation, which is the city of Norfolk, Virginia, which actually adopted a 100-year plan with regard to sea level rise and identified neighborhoods and activities that they thought might have to change over time. And if I'll search for it while we're discussion's going, try to drop a link into the chat.
Great. Yeah, just a few things. It's absolutely true. And, you know, yeah, I mean, transformation is definitely not universally accepted as the way to go, because it's a little bit, maybe, you know, in a certain way, coming from the researchers, sort of pie in the sky, idealistic, you know, not, cities are very practical. And the Mayor LaGuardia of New York City, his famous comment was, there is no Democratic or Republican way to pick up the garbage. So you know, and cities, they have to be just straight up, they have to just do things, and they cannot do things on the scale of that transformation implies. I mean, Europe, I do think, I think Europe it does a better job on this, because their whole land use planning, the acceptance, the cultural acceptance of we're going to create a community that is resilient and and low carbon. But here in the United States, it's much harder with home rule, individualistic rights, land, the whole land tenure, et cetera. So it's much, really and truly much harder here. I want to, so that's, I want to bring that forward. The other thing I want to bring forward is something that that happened in the New York City panel on climate change, third. It's now in the fourth iteration, and there were 3 neighborhoods. Robin Lachenko and Sheila Foster led this, led the work on equity and environmental justice, and met with the community groups, and also met with the city government folks. And really, I would just say this barrier between, to really fulfill cogeneration, and that the community groups and the EJ groups actually have a voice and real power in the implementation, I also think is very, very hard. Something that we worked on in New York City panel on climate change from the beginning, trying to really bring these groups together to create these joint solutions, that really had the community buy-in. Certainly from our experience in New York City, it's been very challenging. So I think learning how to, and now final point is the visioning. That I think is a way forward. Absolutely. And that visioning exercise is definitely what we need more of.
Pam, did you want to make any comment?
Oh, yes, I was sort of interested, coming from a biodiversity background, to see the sort of green and blue elements there. And I suppose my mind immediately went to how we can use the sort of vegetation for climate adaptation, climate mitigation in such a way that biodiversity is enhanced as well. So the sort of thing I was talking about in my lecture. And I'd be really interested to hear from Cynthia what she sees as the sort of difficulties of combining using green infrastructure for climate adaptation and mitigation while enhancing biodiversity, because, as you know, for me, I'm passionate about integrating different issues, and climate change isn't an issue to be tackled on its own. Thanks, Sylvia.
Yes, thank you, Pam. Thank you very much. And also, maybe Manishka could share. I'll just say a couple of words, and then maybe Manishka, who is coordinating lead author for the nature-based solutions for the city's assessment. But just want to say that I think this is absolutely critically important. Bill and I, again, another quick anecdote. Bill and I, long ago, we proposed New York City to be one of those biodiversity hotspots. And all the ecologists, we were in Low Library, this very fancy building at Columbia University, and all the ecologists got up and walked out. Because they said, no, but New York City has killed biodiversity. But what we were saying was, through its worldwide trade, that actually, if New York City, first of all, every little scrap has to be, nurtured for biodiversity and more. But at the same time, you see cities as the cultural leaders can encourage and implement biodiversity elsewhere. So I definitely am all for it. Manishka, wanted to say a few words about the chapter.
Yes, I'll briefly talk a little bit about the NBS element of the assessment report on climate change in cities, the 3rd edition, and then Leonard, it'll be over to you. Yeah, we are getting started on the nature-based solutions element. Pam, it'd be great if we can get you involved in it as well. And this is looking at NBS from an urban perspective. So we are just working on the extended outlines. So if anyone wants to get involved, reach out to me. We'd love to have more authors and case studies. And one thing I'd like to highlight, and something that we really want to build on in this element, is getting the private sector more involved and getting financing from the private sector, but also exploring innovative financing mechanisms to enable NBS in urban areas, I think would be key, and excited to work on that. And over to you, Leonard.
Thank you, Manishka. Excellent presentation as usual, Cynthia. I want to come back for a second to David's initial question when he raised the linkage between energy and cities. Clearly, energy is still a really critical input into the way cities operate. And I don't think there's much getting away from that. So there's this very clear linkage between the amount of energy cities use and how they manage it. What I'm wondering, Cynthia, is if there's any evidence at all from case studies or from your own experience or from anybody else's experience that we've learned anything of significance that we can apply from the COVID experience to transforming energy use in cities. That's something that I've been wondering about for a while. But so sorry to bring this back to David's initial question now, since we've moved on.
Leonard, I think this is, I think the general question, not even energy, but just have we learned anything from COVID that we really can take forward to climate change as well? You know, we've written articles about that. Maybe we can post that with Chris Ebi and Jean Polutikoff. We wrote an article about really bringing the two together. You know, everybody felt on the energy side, everybody was really excited in the beginning when no one went anywhere. Do you remember this? And all the CO2 emissions went down at the beginning of COVID, but that was really short-lived. And then it all came back, certainly, and this is anecdotal, in New York City, because people didn't want to go on the subways anymore. And then they all bought cars and they all then drove into the city. The traffic was horrible, horrendous, and nothing really happened. But so I would say, I mean, I think we have to be, you know, this whole green recovery, and we're going to do both. You know, there were so many articles about that, and the city groups did it. But I guess, you know, does anybody have a positive example? Because I'm not sure that I do. You know, although working just to, you know, I don't like to be pessimistic. So just to finally say that last slide that I showed of our work that combined heat and the heat interventions with the COVID-19 interventions, the city was very, very, very interested, very receptive to that kind of work, bringing the two together. And we're now, by the way, following on that with the sea level rise and coastal flooding compound risks as well. But, you know, other authors, or David, what do you think about this energy, COVID, nexus, you know, climate change nexus? Is there anything we can end on in a positive light?
Well, certainly the idea of working remotely presumably will reduce transportation costs and transportation emissions. But on a broader scale, you know, Con Edison, which is the energy company, electrical energy company here in New York City, they send around in their bills, they said, if you would like us to the energy that you are receiving, if you would like that to come from renewable resources, it might be more expensive. We're telling you that, but just check off on your bill that this is where you would like the energy to come from. So that's an example of an attempt being made by an energy company in a city to try to favor renewable resources and limit their ultimate emissions.
Joel, what do you think about the combination coming out of COVID and climate change?
That's it. We could do a book on that, eh, Cynthia? That's a tough question. So I think the lessons from COVID are complex. I mean, one of the things that I think, well, first, I mean, look, if we in March of 2020, if you had said that the US would lose 100,000 people, would have been horrified. If you had said 1 million, people wouldn't have believed you. I mean, this has just been a catastrophe. There's no way around it. I mean, it's just been just a disaster in terms of how we as a society, and then globally, I mean, now the studies suggesting what tens of millions of people actually have died. Which, by the way, which was an approach that was used, I don't know if it was the first time, but I know when we were looking at heat stress deaths back in the old days, remember with Larry Kalkstein, Larry didn't look at how deaths were codified by coroners. He looked at total deaths and looked at daily, because cities at morgues report deaths by day. And Larry looked at during a heat wave, well, total deaths shot up, and figured this is probably the result of the heat wave. Didn't give you exact cause, but that's interesting that approach is used on COVID, and we see just how extensive the loss has been. I think one thought is, and this is interesting in terms of behavior, it's hard to get people to change behavior. You can get people to sacrifice, you can do a lockdown. My take is you get to do it once. And once you lift it, people want to return back to the way they were. And it really was technological change, vaccines, that helped, but didn't totally solve the problem, get us out of it. And yet, unfortunately, the whole thing got politicized, which is sort of, I think is clear evidence of our governance problems, but also elsewhere. It's not just in this country. So there's a lot of complications here, but I think there's a lot of lessons learned in terms of how we address these things. And I think it's hard to get people to sacrifice their own welfare. Look at the yellow vest revolt, look at how upset people are about gasoline prices. So it's, it's not that those things don't work. I just saw something on the news this morning about, clearly sales of EVs and demand for electric vehicles is skyrocketing, as a result of people realize that it's a lot cheaper, to fill your car with electricity rather than gas. So that's a good outcome, although it's a difficult way to do it. So this is you've asked a tough question. I'm not giving a very coherent answer, but I think, we need a lot of thoughtfulness. One difference I will say was COVID, we had to react. This came very suddenly, and we had to react very quickly. Climate change has been more gradual. We do have the luxury, if you will, of at least being more deliberate and thoughtful. And I think we're taking advantage of that and keep pushing in terms of what approaches we can. But this is hard stuff in terms of, particularly on the transformation, and both on the, we talk about transformation. My comment earlier was transformation on the adaptation side. That's hard. It is also hard on the mitigation side too. And, we need, some clear visioning, good leadership that's realistic about what can be done, and, and persistence. So, so it could go on and on, but I'll stop.
That's great. So I maybe give my final comment. Just when I put up the list of topics that are being brought forward through the third assessment report on climate change in cities, perception and behavior is one of them. And communication is a new one. We've never had one on that. And I think gathering those folks, the social scientists who really study those, I think that's an element of the transformation that we really need to really bring forward and say, okay, this is actually how we've said you have to do this, this, and this. And now it's like, okay, how do you get everybody to do this, this, and this? I think that will be a very important chapter in ARC 3.3.
Thank you, Cynthia, once again for the fantastic talk and for the Q&A session. And thank you, David, for hosting. And to the Our Warming Planet authors, thank you so much for joining. And we were going to wrap up at 11 local time, but the discussion was so good and we still have attendees. So we wanted to continue on for a little bit longer. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions in the chat box, but I think the discussion was really useful, and I think we went and touched other topics, which I think the attendees found interesting. So thank you so much. I'm just going to wrap up briefly, and then I'll be inviting David to give a few last words as well. So just to remind everyone that we are recording, and the recordings are available and are almost up to date. So please, you can go to this website. I've also put this on the chat. This is where the recordings are. And thank you to Noah CC Run for hosting it. Once again, this is the book that we've taken all these lectures off of. And you can use this discount code right on top to get 30% off. It's also available in multiple formats, the hardcover, soft cover, and as an ebook. And in 2 weeks, we have 2 lectures coming up. One will be with Joel Smith. He'll be talking to us about climate change risks and the United States and its security interests, so a very interesting topic. We also have Nobuo Mimura and Yasuaki Hijioka from Japan, who will be talking about climate change and natural disasters in Japan. So 2 great talks coming up in 2 weeks. I've also included the link to register, and we will be sending out the announcement in a few days as well. We have a lot of great talks that have been completed. That includes talks from Leonard Nurse and Pam Berry as well. So you can get those by going to that link. And then we still have some great topics coming up over the next couple of months. So look out for our announcements. And over to you, David, for a few last words. Thank you.
So I'd also like to emphasize that the slides such as those Cynthia showed for each of these talks are an inherent part of these books, and they're available for downloading from these books for use in educational institutions, for use in just groups talking about climate and climate change impacts. So this novel aspect of these textbooks includes not only a write-up about the topic, but the availability of PowerPoint slides for your use and educating others and educating yourself. So keep that in mind. Thanks again, Cynthia.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Manishka, Jen, and everyone. It's great to see everyone. And really, as people have said, great discussion. Really, thanks for the great discussion. Wonderful.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
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 Thank you, Cynthia. Excellent.
Bye.
Bye.